Kia ora, welcome. Thank you very much for having me this morning. It's an absolute privilege to be here. Why on a rainy, wet Monday morning should you show up to hear about the future of work? Well, I think the more that we hear about the future of work, the more that we actually do the analysis around the future of work, the more that we actually realise that as business leaders, as civil society leaders, it probably really, in fact, I think it is almost certainly going to be the issue of our generation. Joe Nye, the famous Harvard Business School professor, who along with Peter Drucker is really recognised as it were, the father of leadership. Joe recently said that for us as business leaders, the future of work is our big moment. How we play the future of work, how we lead and guide our organisations through the topics associated with the future of work really is going to be the defining moment in terms of whether we're on the right or the wrong side of history. The second thing which I think we're also discovering, the Prime Minister's trip to China is very much in the news at the moment. Probably the future of work is also going to become the geopolitical issue of our time. The Chinese leadership have been pretty open in their description that there have been 3 industrial revolutions to date. China has not been relevant or significant in any of those 3. It's not going to lose the 4th industrial revolution. In debates around Huawei are much less around security than they are around who actually really owns the strategic assets, the strategic databases and information in a future of work world. So I would contend, but many more august commentators would contend that the future of work really will be the geopolitical issue of our time. I think for you as the Sustainable Business Council, the future of work also offers, without sort of, offering up utopian solutions, but I do think, and particularly for smaller economies like New Zealand, the future of work does offer a once-in-a-generation opportunity to break some of those trade-offs that we've dealt with, particularly around productivity, and I would argue particularly around some of the really tough to solve sustainability issues that we've seen. I believe the future of work and sustainability issues really will merge into, if we solve the future of work in the right way, it really creates the playbook, as it were, to help resolve in a much more cathartic way many of the sustainability issues that folk like you have been passionate about and have considered for many days and months. Let me share with you also some research that it always, I think, is helpful to have a common fact base when we look at to challenging and difficult and uncertain issues like the future of work. McKinsey has invested quite a lot globally in creating a database and a methodology. We've deployed that in most of the major economies, and we have done some research in New Zealand that was historically, we approximated on the basis of the US database what the implications were for New Zealand. Earlier this year, rather than just doing an approximation, we actually built bottom-up using New Zealand data, but the global model, our assessment of what are the implications for us in Aotearoa in terms of the future of work. So I'd like to share with you that thing. It doesn't deviate significantly from what you've seen from folk like us in the past, but I think now we actually, rather than the approximate data, we actually have our own data broken down regionally with our industries that we actually know is a high quality, high integrity database. The other thing about the future of work that I think is also important, it has real practical implications. You might argue that even more important than the geopolitical implications is we may lose that great icon of New Zealand life, the barking sheepdog. So this is actually, that's not actually the Maverick enterprise, but Maverick DJI, who are the Chinese drone, the world's leader consumer drone maker, have now produced a replacement for the sheepdog. Now, several of you may have seen this on Radio New Zealand 2 weeks ago, but literally there are now hundreds of farmers, particularly in the South Island, using barking drones as a replacement for sheepdogs. So as the owner of the smallest and least productive sheep and beef station in New Zealand, I purchased one of these last week and I'm looking forward to Easter to deploy it. But again, the future of work, the reason that I give this, it's not some ethereal, conceptual idea. There are very practical, and I know you're going to hear in terms of what the ports of Auckland have done, very practical, real-life examples that are happening now. It's not something that's just coming. It's something that is with us now. And in terms of the database and the information that we've learned if you look at today, and when it comes to the future of work, I think there's three really important considerations. The first is that when we think about the future of work, think about it less as taking away whole jobs and more about it taking away tasks and reshaping jobs. So it's less around the robots taking our jobs. It's much more around the robots and AI taking away tasks and reshaping jobs. Now, that's not that it won't take away jobs, it will, but the major phenomena is much more the reshaping of what we think of work and how work is actually organised. So when you look at today in terms of, and what can technically and economically automated today, 40% of all work activities, of all tasks today can technically and economically be eliminated. But only 2%, in fact less than 2% of all jobs can actually be automated today. There's then a really important consideration which the modelling really was the tough part of the modelling, is that is potential. But as we know, adoption's a very different thing. There are many institutional factors that the human factor needs to come into play as to whether that potential is actually realised. And we built three scenarios. The scenario that we argue is the most likely, this number by 2030 moves to 60%. So in 2030, 60% of all work activities can be automated. And we believe that 21% of activities will actually be automated. So when you look at the adoption factors, that's the scenario. Now, we also built a scenario where this number becomes 45, but we believe that will take very proactive intervention by government and very proactive intervention by business leaders. Why this actually matters in these numbers, New Zealand is actually at the slightly lower end of the spectrum. So if you look at this number for Australia, it's 23, 24%. For the US, it's even higher. For economies like Japan, it actually gets into the low 40s, given the industrialised nature of their economy. So we are essentially in the middle of the pack, maybe actually slightly at the bottom end of the pack for the OECD world. But again, 2030 isn't that far away, and that's a pretty meaningful number. It then grows to 40% 5 years later. Now, the really good news, and I often say when you think about the future of work, there is good news, there's indifferent news, and there's not so good news. The good news is the future of work really is, and this when I talk about the once-in-a-generation opportunity. New Zealand has had anemic and terrible productivity growth literally since the late 60s. In fact, our productivity growth has declined by 15% every decade since then. So it's not, when you look at the prospectivity of what that means going forward, we cannot be sanguine around that. That is a real problem. That midpoint scenario that I presented previously offers an incredible opportunity for us to break that bad habit around very poor productivity growth. And this is what it potentially can essentially, increase by 56%. Our labour productivity growth has really meaningful implications around that, adds nearly 20% to our annual GDP growth, and most importantly, what that does to our per income growth in terms of, if Grant Robinson was here, I would be able to share a number of other, as it were, living standards measures as well that also improve along with these more traditional metrics. Why this is even more significant for New Zealand, one of the reasons that we've missed out, you might say, listen, technology change is nothing new. We've seen that for a long time. One of the reasons that New Zealand has had such poor labour productivity growth is many of the big, as it were, productivity improving, technology-driven productivity improvement tools that have been available for the last 20, 30 years have actually been very expensive, high capital cost. Things like mainframe computers, ERP systems, they were available for the big end of town. But as you know, New Zealand is a SME economy. And those productivity tools have been inaccessible, have been too expensive to access for what is the majority of our economy. The beauty of the future of work is most of the work transforming tools are cloud-based. They're not high capital costs. They're typically variabilized costs. They're as-a-service type tools. So they are able to go much, much deeper into our economy than any of the previous productivity tools have. So for us in particular, whereas the US, even Australia, participated much more meaningfully in benefiting from these traditional technology tools, the future of work really is something that is custom made for us as a small Pacific nation at the bottom of the world. And it's all the more imperative that we have to embrace it to be able to get these benefits. It does have an implication for jobs as well. And this is the picture that we've built using the model that is essentially the regional picture for New Zealand. And what we've looked at is, again, what are the jobs that are lost as a result of the future of work, but what are the jobs that are created? What are the jobs that are gained? Now, unsurprisingly, it is Auckland and the larger cities of New Zealand that benefit the most, and it is the regions that suffer the most. This has been done at a very granular level. Kirk and I were at a forum recently where I presented this, and I got asked two questions at the tea break. One, did we incorporate Gloria Vale in the West Coast? So no, it's not quite that granular. We don't have Gloria Vale specific data for the West Coast. And we were also asked in terms of why does Northland do so well? Is that a punt on the leadership of Shane Jones? And both may be true, but neither have been considered in the data that has been used here. But it does have, again, somewhat unsurprisingly, it is the regions, and we see this globally, the regions do disproportionately wear the challenge of the future of work. Many of the new jobs that are created are much more sharing economy, next generation type of jobs. Cities obviously have real increasing returns to scale and scope, and therefore benefit disproportionately. But again, and also places like Northland, because of healthcare, tourism, those sorts of jobs end up meaningfully being positively created. Hence, you get this regional picture across New Zealand. And the one thing also around the future of work, and this is the sort of, as it were, the in-between news, the future of work in New Zealand will actually create more jobs than it destroys. But the transitions and how we handle and manage the transitions is very much in our hands. This picture, again, is out to 2030. As you can imagine, the dislocation that goes on as we manage that through can either be managed to reasonably modest unemployment scenarios. It can also be problematic that could take us up to some of the higher unemployment levels that we've seen traditionally in New Zealand. I believe this is in our hands. We may need in fact, we will need to innovate around some of our institutions, but how we come out on this picture is completely in our own hands. The not so good news around the future of work is the future of work threatens to make inequality structural. And there's two reasons why the future of work threatens to make inequality structural. Number one is, it's a generalisation, but essentially the future of work takes away middle income jobs and replaces it with low income and high income jobs. On top of that, there's also a demand consideration that there is, again, excess demand in terms of for, as it were, higher skilled jobs and lower demand for less skilled, highly automatable jobs. And therefore, not only do you get the jobs going away and be created, you get a wage effect. You get a demand-supply effect on top of that, which accentuates wages. And therefore, if you look in New Zealand on the midpoint scenario, we see the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, grow by 16% versus 2016 and 2030. This is a problem in terms of societies that have that rate of change around. We know inequality today isn't in a great place. That number's not something to be sanguine around. And where I'm delighted to be joined on the panel with some of the most thoughtful people in New Zealand that are thinking around what to do about this, the big solution, the primary antidote to that is reskilling. Reskilling and retraining. But also reskilling and retraining is not just, as it were, good intentions are not good enough. Many of you may have had the privilege to read the book Janesville, which talks about the largest city in the US where the largest GM factory went away. And it was also the home of the largest reskilling effort ever seen in the world in terms of the resources per capita that were pumped into that. Unfortunately, they now talk around the Janesville double whammy because the folk that ended up the worst were those that actually participated in the reskilling programs because they ended up being reskilled for jobs that didn't exist. So reskilling is not a universal good if it's not done well. And that's why I think you'll hear from our panel members some really thoughtful perspectives on why we just don't need reskilling, but how we do it well. How can you as business leaders respond, and what are some of the global responses that we're seeing? I think one, there is the opportunity to actually shape the nation. It sounds very grandiose, but we do see companies like State Street. State Street really led the charge around the presidential pledge, around the commitment to reskill 1 million workers each per organisation. We do think there really is an opportunity, and given the smallness and the nimbleness, and I do congratulate again seeing folk from the Future of Work Tripartite Forum, we do have a group of leaders that again I think get the importance of this and are prepared to lead and shape and innovate. We're also seeing organisations that are prepared to lead their industry. I would highlight, if you go, Walmart have recently produced a report on how the future of work is fundamentally going to reshape how we think about a job. As you know, Walmart has a workforce larger than New Zealand overall. They have a hypothesis, which I tend to agree with, that argues that when we think about a job the very nature of a job going forward is essentially going to be a fixed component, as it were, an Uber layer, a sharing economy layer, and also a degree of personal development and vocational education and training that's hardwired into what it actually means to have a job. So they're doing some very, very good thinking in terms of what does the future of a job really look like. And also we do think, at a minimum, staying in the game, understanding the implications for you and partnering. Now, I think what Auckland Airport are doing with ARA, I know just over here what ATEED are, the cornerstone tenant in and around the CBD Jobs and Skills Hub. I do think we're seeing some terrific things in New Zealand, really understanding what it takes just to stay relevant as a business. But I think as a nation, we can really excel in terms of rising less from just staying in the game to make sure that we have business leaders that are leading their industries, but also really participating overall. There are several of us from the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council here today. We feel very accountable that we are playing a role in really helping participate here. And again, we should be held accountable for making sure that you're seeing cathartic action that is meaningful at the national level emerging on that front. And look, final thought before I hand back, I do think the great Charles Darwin quote that it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that is most adaptable to change. And when we go forward, our argument again, there were going to be many of the strongest, many of the smartest that will not survive. We do think those that adapt the best are going to be those that really thrive in a future of work world. And I think that as New Zealanders, I think adaptation, being adaptable, being nimble on our feet, I think is a national characteristic. But it's not going to happen by itself. I think unless we collectively rise to the moment, rise to the occasion. And I'm delighted, and again, I celebrate the Sustainable Business Council that they are elevating this topic. And again, thank you for listening. It's a real privilege to have been here this morning. Thank you so much.